So, this is my review for Tombs of the Blind Dead. So, Tombs of the Blind Dead was released on April 10th or April 11th. I've seen both days claimed, but April 10th or 11th of 1972. It is a Spanish/Portuguese film, and the setting is set at the medieval town of Berzano, which is apparently on the border of Spain and Portugal. So the movie starts off at a public pool where two women meet up with each other, turning out to be old schoolmates, which when I looked up this film, it said that, oh, like college friends, but it didn't say it in there that they went to college. I do not recall in the English version them saying they went to college. It just said they were in school. Anyway, I know that's like meticulous or pedantic, but anyway, I just want to point that out. So these old schoolmates, which are named Betty and Virginia, meet up at the pool. So Betty owns a mannequin shop, which is next to a graveyard or a mortuary, I can't remember which. And Virginia is with her boyfriend named Roger. So Roger shows up and he clearly seems to show interest in Betty and invites her to come with them to a cabin that he and Virginia were going to, and Betty agrees to go. So Virginia already starts to get jealous as she can see that Roger finds Betty attractive. So the next day, well, before I get into that, actually, starting at the beginning part of the film, the movie starts having these odd cuts, and it's really at the beginning where the scenes will just quickly be chopped together, which is during like about the first 30 minutes. Did I already say that? The first 30 minutes has these weird edits to it. It was strange, but I suppose that maybe the creators of the film just didn't have the time to maybe recreate scenes or fix small errors such as this. But some of the audio in the film also seems to be desynced, but that could also potentially be from just for the English dub. Some of the dialogue would be in Spanish in the film, maybe just like a line or two, but not much else. I only bring this up because, in a way, it actually reminded me of the film Black Sunday, where it was filmed in English, but it had to be dubbed over because many of the Italian actors had such thick accents they apparently couldn't understand what they were saying. So I just wondered if the actors were able to dub over their own characters, because according to Wikipedia, the film was originally recorded in Spanish. I couldn't find any info on who dubbed what, so whatever. I guess that's just a mystery. But anyway, back to the film though. Virginia, Roger, and Betty meet at the train station the next day. Betty running late because fucking Betty. Anyway, and not long after, we see a flashback scene where Betty and Virginia were in school. I guess college is when this happened. College. God, I can't believe it. How many people end up having lesbian encounters in college? My God. But anyway, so Betty ends up turning out to be a lesbian, and they had a lesbian encounter. Betty found herself to be attracted to Virginia, and it's implied that Betty would even, I guess, marry Virginia if she could. Because Virginia was looking at a magazine and it was a couple, a male and a female, that were like dancing, I guess like maybe recently engaged. So in the flashback, Betty and Virginia, they start kind of dancing, and then Betty goes in for the peck, and she kisses Virginia very quickly, and it shocks and actually like upsets Virginia, who to me is implied to just be straight, not even bisexual. So even though this movie came out before the film Alucarda, this scene actually reminds me a bit of the relationship that Alucarda had with Justine. It's interesting to me how lesbianism was shown in movies from the 70s, and strangely, it feels like lesbians were shown more in the 70s than in films from the 80s and 90s, but that just might be how it feels to me. I'm not sure if that's actually true. According to film lore, trivia about the movie, the actresses that played Betty and Virginia had to drink some wine and loosen up before the lesbian scene because they hadn't ever played lesbians before. And I'm not gonna lie, even though I'm not like offended by it or anything, truly there's no point to the lesbian plot thread. Like, what? I'm not saying it like, no, delete it, but it's kind of like, what was the point of the lesbian part? Really? There's really nothing to it. Anyway, I mean, I guess maybe at the very end later on with what happens with Pedro, but it's kind of like, the more I thought about it, I was like, there's really no point for the lesbian plot point here. It literally does nothing for the movie. But anyway, so to me, I also wanted to just, I guess, point this out. I don't, was just how, to me, Betty was the lesbian and not Virginia. Now, looking up the movie, online, it seems like Virginia is lumped in. And I'm not saying that it's like bad to be a lesbian, because it's not. But to me, it's like you watch the film and Virginia is not accepting Betty's advances. So it's just interesting to me how they're both considered lesbians when Virginia was not accepting of that romantic advance. So, anyway, Betty and Roger, when they're on the train, they end up getting friendly with each other. And it was like as if they already knew each other. For a while, I actually thought that the plot to the movie was going to be something like Roger and Betty running away together because, like, I thought it would have been revealed that they secretly knew each other. But that's not what happens. Maybe that's what like the directors wanted to trick us into thinking that. I'm not sure. And truly, Roger's relationship with Virginia technically wasn't clearly made known either. We are just to assume that they're together. But Virginia gets jealous with how friendly Betty and Roger are towards each other. And despite Betty clearly being into Virginia in the past, sorry, I was like, which one? Despite Betty being into Virginia, the latter decides that she's going to jump off or hop off the train and go wherever. So I don't know. It was just strange. It's kind of like, and that's the thing too. Going back, it's like, well, was Betty lesbian or bisexual? Because Virginia thought that Betty wanted Roger. And then it's like, well, no, Betty's a lesbian. No, Betty's bisexual. Da, 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 da. Anyway, does it have anything to truly do with the point of the film? No. But there is some bisexuality, if not lesbianism, or lesbianism, bisexuality in the film. There you go. It's there. So anyway, Virginia is jealous of how friendly Roger and Betty are with each other, and so she ends up going to one of the train workers comes up asking for her ticket, and then she was like, "Can you stop the train? I'll pay you. We're to stop at the next village." The train worker is like, "No, we can't do that," and he won't tell her why because it's implied that the village they're about to come to is cursed, basically. But Virginia grabs her bags anyway and she hops off the train and she walks into the countryside. And it's not made clear what her plans were for this or where she was going. It just seemed like a small minded plan that wouldn't have gotten her very far. And in a way, I actually was right. You know, Virginia walks towards an old ruined castle or castle like building that's abandoned. And we see just these beautiful shots of the countryside and the stonework to the main setting of the film. This is where majority of the scenes end up taking place later on. And I really enjoyed how beautiful the movie looked with its shots of nature and architecture. So, as said before, I don't know what Virginia's plans were, but she finds a nice abandoned building to spend the night in, lighting some brush on fire in a hearth. Laying in a sleeping bag, she reads from a pocketbook while her portable radio plays jazz. And then we see some graves that surround the abandoned area starting to move, and the blind dead start to emerge. The blind dead are partially human actors in costumes, while some are, obviously dummies that are dressed up. Both are actually fantastically creepy and even funny at times. It's clear that dummy dead hands, dead hands were used to creep through the doors and windows, which I found funny. It's like creepy looking, but it's just like a Halloween prop. And, it made me laugh. Seeing silly little props like that. But, it was good in a way too, because I always have this appreciation for practical effects, especially now as we see more AI, and just CGI kind of crap. Everything is so digital now. It's nice to see a silly little practical effect in, yes, an older movie. So the blind dead themselves aren't really scary as they just chase after Virginia, but slowly. Though I did still find them to be creepy. Even though they walk slowly through the building to come after her, they would even ride horses as seen throughout the film. And that part to me would be actually scary to see basically, what is it? Ghost riders in the sky. Anyway, they're like ghost riders in a way. I find the horse riding scenes to be especially like creepy but cool, almost like the literal depictions of the death card in tarot, if you're familiar with that. That's what the imagery of them riding on the horses reminds me of. So Virginia ends up running away from the abandoned building and gets on a horse, but as she rides away, two of the blind dead catch up with her and knock her off the horse she's on. And then they surround her and, oh my god, they kill her. So the movie then goes on to follow Roger and Betty, who are concerned for Virginia as she never comes back or shows up to the camping area, or she doesn't call either. And so they try to ask about the abandoned building that she was seen walking to, but they are denied info because the locals are like, it's against our code to talk about such a cursed place. So the two end up renting horses to check out the area, and they find her shoe, but then they're greeted by the police who then tell them that Virginia was murdered. And it was funny, I remember this scene because Roger was like, how did you find us? And the cop, the police, the detective, I guess you'd really call him, was like, he said something along the lines of, we may be a little behind here, but we do have telephones. And it's like, oh yeah, you can just call people, you know. So Roger and Betty are taken to the morgue to identify Virginia, and for some reason they end up being shown the wrong person, which of course is funny, like comedy. That made me laugh. But then they reveal Virginia, and it's revealed she has all like these sores and bites all over her body. And I believe that they said it was like 12 different bite marks, or like 12 different like bite sets, right? Like different sets of teeth, basically. And so the police end up thinking that it's potentially a gang of ruffians, like it's real people that might have killed her. But Betty and Roger end up learning that it was, to skip forward basically, because I don't want to summarize the movie, I just want to review it. But Betty and Roger end up finding out that it was very likely the old Knights Templar who harmed or haunted the place, that had likely killed Virginia. So the movie goes on to show that the town of Barzana was once a site for the Knights Templar, who had once gone on a conquest in the east and then came back practicing black magic. They would sacrifice virgins and suck their blood for, I guess, according to like outside of the movie plots that describe it, say they would get eternal life from this, but I literally do not recall them actually saying that in the film. It just said, oh, they sacrifice people and suck their blood. And I was like, so it's like vampiric in a way? That's like not really even touched on. Like, they're kind of vampires, really. It was almost like as if the Knights Templar would just come after anybody that would trespass their property, like vampire landlords. What's interesting, though, is that there is historical connections with the Knights Templar and black magic and even the whole Baphomet symbol thing. So if you look it up on Wikipedia, apparently Baphomet, it may be a mishearing of Muhammad. There is a lot of backstory that you can read about the Knights Templar. I don't want to get into it for this video, but you can easily read about the history of this kind of stuff, honestly, on Wikipedia, believe it or not. And ironically, what's really ironic for me is that I read a lot about the Knights Templar when I was a teenager, believe it or not. This is actually not because of black magic. I didn't know anything about that. When I was a teenager, I read about the Knights Templar because they had at one point, at least one of their versions of them, had went on the search for the Holy Grail. And I don't know if this is true, but I remember reading that there was a conquest for the Knights Templar to go alongside some certain parts of like Canada, like New Brunswick and stuff like that, looking for the Holy Grail. And it's just interesting how basically certain parts of the world became westernized, if we're going to put it that way, thanks to things like religious conquest. But what's very interesting to me is that as a teenager, I watched documentaries about them, read quite a lot about them, and it for somehow I just never, not once did I ever come across the black magic thing. I don't know how I managed to skip that. But the Knights Templar and black magic are actually also mentioned in the book We Are Satanists, which of course is written by Professor Barton, which also provides an interesting historical perspective to me when I read her book. It's just funny to me. I think maybe like with stuff with like the History Channel, because I remember distinctly when I was in high school, there was a documentary on the History Channel about the Knights Templar. And I guess maybe for something that's supposed to be more, what used to be scientific, or they attempted to be scientific, they probably didn't want to bring up anything about magic because it would diminish credibility in science, blah, blah, blah. Granted, if it to me, it's just kind of like, is it really diminishing it if you're just talking about it from a historical perspective? But we're getting away from the movie. Anyway, back to the movie review. What's interesting is that the original Spanish version of the film, the blind dead are referred to as, when translated, the Warriors of the Orient, which I think is also sort of a nod towards the whole going east and coming back, saying Baphomet type, that kind of whole thing. I wondered if the creators of the movie knew about the Baphomet Muhammad connection or if this was a coincidence. But something tells me that it wasn't, and somebody, I think, knew more historically about the Knights Templar than they probably could have gone into for this film. So the movie paints the Templar revenants, as I guess they're supposed to be called or thought of as. They're thought of as being much more ghosty than zombie-like. They're like ghost vampires, I guess. I really liked the costume design to the creatures, as I had stated before, and the faces of the blind dead have this long, decayed look to them. Not the rotting dead faces as you see in other zombie films. Though I know it's not a zombie film, but you know how in movies such as Dawn of the Dead, which I know that came out after this, but the dead in that movie look entirely just distinctly different. They are distinctly different because they're fresh dead. You know what I mean? The zombies in Dawn of the Dead are fresh, whereas the blind dead in this film are literally centuries old. They're in their graves and they come out at night. But it should be noted, though, what's interesting, and maybe not surprising, but The Blind Dead is inspired by some of George Romero's other films, such as Night of the Living Dead. What I really liked was the decayed centuries look. Like they actually looked like they had been decayed for centuries, been in the ground for centuries. And it fits in so perfectly with the setting of the I don't want to call it a castle necessarily, but just that old stone, old brick like feel to this film. It just fits in so well. They actually surprisingly didn't use very much blood in this film at all. I think the most blood was like at the end of the movie, and there wasn't any fall, as I'll just call it, in the shots either. I really do actually give them props for creating something so creepy without having to throw around animal remains. What's really strange and not really explained is that after Virginia's death, she comes back to life. In this sense, she really is a zombie, is she not? And she ends up killing a guy in the morgue, chomping on his neck. She then makes her way to the mannequin shop that Betty owned. Remember Betty? And she tries to eat Betty's assistant, but the assistant ends up like setting Virginia on fire and she burns to death. The effect used here was really cheesy, but funny to me. And it was kind of clever too, because the scene shows the actress who played Virginia like wailing in pain against a window. And while what is obviously like a separate cell, back when like they did this in film, it was cells, and there's like fire placed over her cell. Right. And so I thought this was a very clever way without actually having to use fire to show a fire in a room. Still, though, when you think about like the point of the film, what was the point of Virginia coming back to life? That's not explained. Uh, did so with her coming back to life, did this mean that she can convert people into zombies too? And what's really weird is that the Templars are supposed to be thought of as revenants, not zombies. But would she be a revenant or would she be a zombie? Like I said, this is never addressed. So while Betty and Roger go to get more information about the Templars from a college professor, the police end up showing up and they inform the professor that they found his adult son who had left home about 2 years before and was like sort of missing, but obviously not really. So the police suspect, they reveal that they suspect the professor's son, who's named Pedro, and Pedro's gang of people for having potentially killed Virginia, because Pedro ended up living only 7 kilometers from the abandoned village that Virginia was killed at. So Roger and Betty decide to go to the area that Pedro lives in to see if he knows anything about the area that Virginia died at. So eventually they meet up, basically, and Pedro and I guess you'd say his girlfriend, Maria, end up joining Betty and Roger at the abandoned village. And this really doesn't make sense what they're attempting or hoping to do, but it's like as if they're hoping to find whoever beat up and killed Virginia and maybe shoot them themselves. Of course, this isn't the case and isn't even possible. And when they get there, they're just like hanging out in the same exact abandoned room that, Virginia was going to fall asleep in. Interestingly, Pedro takes an interest in Betty and he tries hitting on her. She tries to reject him, trying to tell him that she wasn't interested in men because it's revealed that she had a bad encounter with a man in the past, which is kind of something like that's always the trope in movies. A woman is never a lesbian because she's attracted to women. For some reason in movies, women are only lesbians because they had a bad encounter with a man. Whatever. I mean, it was 1972. But this doesn't stop Pedro, and he unfortunately ends up raping Betty. Meanwhile, Roger and Maria are alone, and they kiss, but Maria thinks that Roger and Betty are more than just friends. And it's strange that this is brought up because, one, it really has nothing to do with the plot of the movie, and two, it's not up until now, which is the end of the movie, that Roger seems to only say that Betty is a friend. It's never made known whether or not Roger knew that Betty was a lesbian and that she had had a crush and kissed Virginia in the past. In general, there really wasn't any fleshing out of any of the characters in the film, though I feel like the only character that had any actual backstory was Betty. So, Pedro ends up being eaten by the blind dad, and Betty runs into the building that Maria and Roger were inside. Roger goes outside and he sees Pedro being eaten, and he completely unloads his gun, shooting at them, which of course is useless. So the blind dad then make their way towards Roger, who was stuck outside of the building because the door was locked and Maria wouldn't allow Betty to open the door. Maria and Betty get into a fight because Maria was jealous that Betty obviously had sex with Pedro, because Maria just assumed that the sex was consensual. And so she's jealous that somebody had her man, I guess. And they get into a fight, and it's just dumb shit. Just dumb shit. And so the Revenants, the blind dad, are getting closer to Roger, and they ended up being basically the reason why he dies, and they slice his arm off. So Maria is also really one of the reasons why, I would say one of the main reasons truly why they die. Spoiler. So when Roger's arm gets cut off, they finally open the door and drag him in. But this also, of course, allows the blind dead in. And their attention is immediately turned towards Maria because she screams in terror. They eat her, and then while Roger is dying in Betty's lap, he tells her not to make a sound or else they'll hear her. And though this was an interesting point to make in evading them, I feel like it was pretty dumb to just bring this up last minute in the movie. To me, if it was brought up before, this could have made for some like actually entertaining scenes where they like maybe sneak past the Revenants, but no. So Betty tries to stay quiet, but the blind dead end up hearing her heartbeat as she runs away. She runs far and ends up making it close to the train tracks from the beginning of the film and collapses on the ground. So the train workers from the beginning of the film are still there, working that job, and they see her and they stop the train, one of them getting off to help her back up into the train. But the blind dead were still chasing Betty, and they are closing in, basically. And what do you know? I don't have any problem bringing this up. They close in and then they get on the train and they kill everybody on the train except for Betty. Ironically, Betty, she ended up hiding on a coal cart, in a coal cart on another part of the train. So the train, I guess automatically makes its way into town, and basically it's implied that a cycle of, I guess, worldwide domination by the Knights Templar is at least possible, thanks to me, what I consider to be Betty's selfishness, really. I mean, I know it's like, Betty, you should have just died, but it's kind of like, no, really, think about it. Betty was so concerned about getting on the train, she didn't bother to think about how the Revenants would kill everybody else. I mean, all right, Betty, thanks. Now the whole world is getting killed by the damn Revenants, too. Anyway, the movie ends with Betty screaming as she sees that the Knights Templar pretty much ate everyone on the train. What was funny was that the movie didn't end with film, but actually photographs. It ends with stills of her screaming. I guess they took actual pictures and just used that instead. I found the movie funny, in a cheesy way, but honestly, overall good. Despite the stuff that I know I probably sounded really negative about the movie, but surprisingly, I give it a 4 out of 5 stars. And not because it's super amazing, but it's really more for the filmography and costume design. I don't want to repeat myself, so I'm not overemphasizing it, but I really, really love the way the Knights Templar are made in this film. I love their costumes. They are just so creepy. I really appreciate how creepy they look. I think the filmmakers got this portion right. Seriously. Of course, yes, there's issues with the movie, such as the editing errors in the beginning, but I still think it's a really great film. You know, if you like horror, especially honestly stuff like Dawn of the Dead, I think that you should check it out. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I actually really like this. See ya.